what's going on in Ukraine is, I think, not being covered properly for a change. Obviously, the mainstream media can't beat their war drums loud enough. And we know what that's about, but unfortunately, people are still beholden to that information. And I think that people are very misinformed as to what's really happening. And I really don't know. So I'm hoping you could share that. You could share that with us.
Well, considering they've dropped all context about the issue, I'm not necessarily shocked. It's a super weird thing. We are the Cuban Missile Crisis had just passed maybe a few days ago. And the idea, basically the Cuban Missile Crisis was the United States refusing to allow Moscow, Warsaw Pact members, to put missiles and weapons in Cuba. The idea being Cuba is run by Castro. And if anything pops off, those missiles can basically be used to hit the United States. Everybody understood it. It was very clear. There was a blockade in order to prevent it, even to the point of going to nuclear war. Honest to God, many of those people full well believed that the world was coming to an end because they didn't necessarily think there would be a way out. Now, this changes on a dime when it comes to Ukraine. And nobody gets the Russian perspective on it, at the very least in the United States, even though they fully got it for the Cuban Missile Crisis. For that matter, even if it was Mexico. If it was Mexico that the government was knocked over and they started putting missiles and weapons and mercenaries and all of this other stuff in, it would be the same thing. The United States would not accept the position that Mexico is an independent nation. Mexico can do whatever Mexico wants. And if Mexico wants to point missiles at the United States, then fair enough, Mexico can do that. Nobody believes that the US would take that position. But you had a situation where NATO basically expanded to the borders of Russia for the last, 40, 50 years, give or take?
Against agreement, in violation of the agreement.
Yes. Yeah, they call it an agreement. But basically, they said when the Soviet Union falls, the U.S. would move, or NATO would move 1 inch to the east. Because all of them understood that that was a provocation. You're taking a military organization and basically encircling a country that you consider to be an enemy for God knows how long. And anytime you bring that up, it's like, but you guys are encircling them. Well, yeah, but we're just the defensive organization. You are a military organization that is surrounding another country in order to get a fait accompli in case anything pops off, whether real or whether propagated. It's that. And so when Moscow comes out and says, we need to have security conversations, and they're like, nope, Moscow doesn't have security concerns. Putin's just making this up. This is just nonsense. And again, this is a country that's been invaded twice by the West, where the last time they lost 26 million people or something? I mean, just insane stuff. And so when they bring up the point, look, you guys expanded to our borders. That's true. That's provocation. That's not anybody making that up. When they make the point of saying you didn't fulfill the Minsk agreements, again, this is a submissive Ukrainian government that at this point had been overthrown, and that Joe Biden was able to basically hold $1 billion up in order to get them to fire a prosecutor. But we don't believe that if the U.S. or for that matter Europe wanted, that they would have fulfilled the Minsk agreements. Well, of course they would have. And fulfilling the Minsk agreements would mean that Ukraine wouldn't be losing 20, how much ever percent of its territory right now. I mean, even this notion of NATO in the membership, Ukraine is made up of ethnic Russian Ukrainians in the east, and you have Ukrainians in the west. At the point where the government was overthrown in 2014, under the U.S. government, U.S. overthrow it. I mean, you can even go back and look at the politicians. All of those politicians were chest thumping a legitimately elected Yanukovych government being overthrown. They applauded it. You have, John McCain on the pages of, I think it's the Washington Post, shaking hands with a Nazi. And then it's like immediately when the government is overthrown and they use these kind of neo-Nazis, these Russophobic groups in order to tip of a spear to overthrow the government. This is not even in conjecture at this point. Victoria Nuland, Jeffrey, I forget his last name, these U.S. representatives are basically talking about it's time to midwife this thing and F the EU and all this other stuff. And then if within a few weeks, the government goes up in a flash? What makes it wilder is that the media, under normal circumstances, is rules-based order. They were perfectly okay with the Yanukovych government being overthrown. That was a government elected by ethnic Russian Ukrainians in addition to the Ukrainians in the West. They overthrew it. There's an awesome memo by William Burns, current CIA director right now. It's called Niet Means Niet. And it's this WikiLeaks doc that basically he makes the point of saying, and I'm paraphrasing, look, if we keep pushing in that country, especially pushing NATO, we're going to create divisions from the standpoint of the East and the West. The East is completely against it because they're ethnic Russian. Of course, they're not going to be on behalf of NATO or for NATO, where the West is perfectly for it. You're going to create a civil war. Russia is going to have to get involved, and it's not something that Russia has to do. Everybody forgot that memo that came out in 2008, the moment that all of this popped off. It's amazing how they forget it. They immediately said there's no Nazis in Ukraine, despite the fact I can show you 30 articles pointing out that there are neo-Nazis in Ukraine. Hell, even Stefan Bandera being put into, a hero of Ukraine back in 2000, I believe it's 8, when the other color revolution took place, or 2004. It's one of those. I forget it. I think it's, yeah. But I guess my point is, this is one of those things that if any of those countries were held up to, meaning if they were put in the same situation, all of those countries will behave in the exact same way, and all of them know it. And the way they deal with it is basically dropping all context to everything that's basically taking place to just say it's Putin's fault. Putin's a madman. NATO had nothing to do with it. Ukraine was just standing there as love and light. When they knocked over the Ukrainian government, the most rational thing in the world happened. The ethnic Russian Ukrainians in the East, recognizing that a bunch of Nazis had basically taken over the government, decided to pull out of the government, meaning it's the most rational thing in the world. If your government collapses, then legitimately elected government, the one that had some level of legitimacy because they were actually elected, collapsed. And they weren't just collapsed, they were overthrown. And so in the context of that government being overthrown and them realizing what is taking place at this moment, they were not unclear of it, despite the American public being unaware of it. And they decided to basically pull themselves out of that government holding referendums. Now, the rub is the Minsk agreements would have still kept those dumbass republics under the auspices of the Ukrainian government. That's the rub. So even though they wanted to pull out and everything else, all things being equal, Minsk would have allowed them to remain under the auspices of the Ukrainian government. They would have been almost like this kind of quasi-independent nation, but still, nonetheless, it would have prevented what we are seeing now, which is a complete catastrophe that never needed to happen in the first place.
We're speaking with Jamarl Thomas of the Progressive Soapbox. You know, we all have our theories as to why this began, but my theory is very simple. There are trillions and trillions of dollars of natural resources in Western Ukraine. We want them. Russia wants them, and I'm sure China wants them. And we're all, playing this game of stratego, as you like to say.
I do. And I also point out that, again, I don't care what language my oligarch speaks. Yeah. My oligarchs can speak Russian or Chinese or Arabic. I really don't care. And It's fascinating that we're so susceptible to thinking that those are real things, right? Like Russian people, they're just people. They're just like us. We have infinitely more in common with them than we do with the top whatever of this country. So I cannot get into that very, it's very xenophobic. It's very nationalistic. I don't like it.
Replace the word Russian with anything.
Yeah, I cannot.
People would lose their minds.
I know. I cannot. And I just feel like, no. We're on the same team with them. It's the people at the top, and it shouldn't matter what language they speak.
No, that's very true. I mean, if you spend all of ever since Trump was elected, demonizing Russia, talking about they were responsible for stealing the election and everything else, well, maybe the public will have a certain temperament about it, especially Democrats, who basically at this point have just left the reservation and is basically at this point have become the neocons. I mean, even to a point that is beyond Republicans, which is super weird. Look, the rationale behind this, a lot of this I think has to do with Nord Stream 2. Nord Stream 2 was going to take billions of transfer fees from the Ukrainian government. That government required those fees in order to keep that government even afloat. And so if you remember, Biden, in fact, Anthony Blinken wrote the book talking about the oil pipeline wars or something to that effect. Meaning that's something that was on their mind. And so when Biden kept threatening Germany, threatening Merkel, threatening the government, basically we're going to pass sanctions on our own friends and everything else, passing sanctions on the companies that were working on the pipeline. Well, they were working on the pipeline because they didn't want to bypass Ukraine. Now, from the U.S. standpoint, our belief was that, or our stated objective was to never have another country to rival us in the way that the Soviet Union rivaled us. Which means that nothing was supposed to ever come out of the situation where Moscow, meaning at the point where the Soviet Union collapsed, there wasn't supposed to be Russia reorganizing its powers and everything else in this particular sense. No, the issue with Ukraine is not really about Ukraine. It's about geopolitical posturing per se. If NATO is not able to assert itself and assert its powers, then what does it mean for NATO? Meaning, if NATO can't use all of its economic powers, or for that matter, its military might, in order to change the material circumstance of the situation on the ground, then does it really have the power that it believed it had at all? And not just that, what does it mean for the world going forward in regards to this kind of hegemonic order collapsing into a multipolar or dual polar world at this point? I mean, think about it for the moment. Look at the other countries that have basically stood out. I mean, 3/4 of the globe is like, yeah, we're not paying attention. We're not playing this. Yeah. And then you get Turkey, Saudi Arabia. These are basically allies of the United States trying to get into BRICS, or for that matter, Belt and Road. Basically, these countries have backed out of this process, realizing that the West has jumped the shark. And all of them, many of them, have had to deal with the West from the standpoint of this kind of intrusion into their countries and intrusion into their, let's say, the democracies or whatever those countries are. And so it's not like they're unaware of the influence of the U.S. in these various countries. I mean, for God's sake, Iraq, Syria, the attempts at Iran. I mean, that's just in the Middle East by itself. I mean, there is a history of the U.S. knocking over various governments, whether it's in South America, the Middle East, or otherwise. And so the rest of the world stays out. They don't want to get involved. But whether they want to get involved or not, they're still stuck with either the higher prices, they're still stuck with the issue of not getting food supplies like wheat or something to that effect. I mean, African nations weren't getting the wheat that they were supposed to be getting. And because the prices have gone up so much that many of those nations have a much harder time paying for it, whereas Europe can afford it, weirdly enough, for the time being, considering the pound and the euro falling through the floor. No, the biggest issue, or the saddest thing about this, is none of this needed to happen. I mean, at the point where Putin was screaming, what is it, January or February, we need a security arrangement. We need to come to a security arrangement. We need to come to a security arrangement. And all of those troops have basically piled up at the border with Russian troops also at the border, because there was a belief that they were going to go in and just basically take out those ethnic Russian territories, the Donbass region. None of this needed to happen. Like, in a sane, sober world, people would be like, okay, we can come up with a new security arrangement in order for everybody's interests to be understood.
Thanks for watching. If you want to support our mission to transform politics into service, please like this video, subscribe, follow us on social media, and consider joining our Patreon, where you'll get early access to our interviews as well as other exclusive content. Links are in the description. Peace out.